I don't remember the moment I decided to run, only the sound of my heels breaking against the wet pavement and the sharp, metallic taste of fear coating my tongue like poison I couldn't swallow. The rain fell in furious sheets, blurring the world into streaks of silver and black, every shadow alive, every echo whispering my name as if the night itself wanted to claim me. Somewhere behind me, a man shouted, rough, slurred, the kind of voice that made your blood run cold because you already knew it belonged to someone who had killed before. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant dying. My lungs burned as I turned into a narrow alley, the stench of garbage and smoke clogging my throat. But the sound of footsteps followed, heavy and deliberate, and I realized with horror that he wasn't running. He didn't have to. Predators never rush. They enjoy the chase. I slipped on the slick concrete, my knees scraping raw against the ground, my palms stinging as I tried to steady myself. But pain was a luxury I couldn't afford. Somewhere in the chaos of my heartbeat, I could still see it. The flash of the gun, the explosion of sound, the man collapsing in front of me, blood blooming across his chest like a crimson flower. I had only gone to take pictures. One story. One lead. A Mafia deal happening under the docks. An anonymous tip that promised a payday and the thrill of danger. I had thought I was ready for the dark. I had no idea the dark was alive. When I reached the end of the alley, my breath caught. A dead end. A rusted dumpster, a brick wall, and no escape. My heart sank into a cold, heavy weight that pressed against my ribs as I turned and saw him. The man who'd been chasing me stepped out of the shadows, his face hidden beneath the brim of his soaked cap, his gun glinting beneath the yellow streetlight. "Shouldn't have seen what you did, sweetheart," he said, his grin slick and empty, his voice thick with the confidence of a man who's done this 100 times. I wanted to scream, to beg, to run, but my body betrayed me. My voice was gone, my legs trembling so violently I could barely stay upright. He raised the gun, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that the rain made everything look clean, even death. Then the world cracked open. A single gunshot, not his. The sound ripped through the alley, a shattering, echoing roar that swallowed my heartbeat whole. The man jerked backward, eyes wide in confusion, a dark bloom spreading across his chest as he collapsed onto the pavement. And behind him, a figure. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that death had come early to escort me to wherever sinners go. But then he stepped forward, and even through the storm I could see him clearly. Tall, composed, his black coat whipping in the wind, his gloved hand lowering a smoking gun. His presence was impossible to look away from. A magnetic pull that froze time, itself. The rain hit his face and rolled down the sharp cut of his jaw, his dark hair slicked back but defiant. His eyes, God, those eyes, the color of midnight, cold and endless, but alive in a way that made me forget how to breathe. He looked at me the way a man studies something he's already decided to keep. I tried to speak, but only a strangled sound came out. The pain from my fall caught up to me then. The sting in my knees, the warmth of blood trickling down my arm, the dizziness from exhaustion. My vision blurred, and I stumbled backward, crashing against the dumpster. He moved toward me, unhurried but purposeful, each step sending ripples of panic and fascination through my body. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, his voice deep and steady, carrying the kind of authority that made disobedience feel dangerous. I didn't mean..." I tried to explain, but the words tangled in my throat. My head was spinning. He crouched down beside me, the faint scent of smoke and leather surrounding him as he studied me. "You saw something you shouldn't have," he murmured, almost to himself, as if he was trying to decide whether I was a liability or something else entirely. My body trembled uncontrollably. Are you going to kill me? I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted an answer. He smiled, not kindly, but not cruelly either, the kind of smile that made promises and threats in the same breath. If I wanted to, you'd already be dead. I don't know why, but that almost comforted me. Then, without warning, the world began to tilt. My vision darkened at the edges, the sound of rain fading to a low hum. I felt his hand on my face, the leather of his glove cool against my burning skin. "You're safe now," he said, and his voice sounded closer, deeper, as though it had slipped beneath my skin. "But safety has a price." And then everything went black. When I woke again, it wasn't to the sound of sirens or the smell of rain-soaked streets. It was silence, thick, heavy, and wrong. My body felt weightless, my head resting against something soft. I blinked, trying to focus, but the ceiling above me was unfamiliar. High, ornate, painted in faint gold patterns that shimmered in the dim light. The sheets beneath me were silk, too fine for any hospital I could ever afford, too soft for anywhere that should feel safe. My wounds were bandaged, my clothes gone. In their place, a satin slip that clung to my skin. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering, every instinct screaming that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, but before my feet could touch the floor, I heard the low creak of a door opening. He stepped inside, the man from the alley, the man who had saved me, or condemned me, I wasn't sure which. Even in the dim light, he was arresting, dressed in black again, crisp and precise, as though chaos bent itself around him rather than touch him. His eyes found mine immediately, and I felt that same electric pull, that strange gravity that made it impossible to look away. "You're awake," he said, his voice even, controlled. My throat was dry. "Where am I?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the window, looking out over something I couldn't see, the city lights casting his silhouette in silver. "You were dying when I found you," he said finally, his tone unreadable. "Now you're not. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" I echoed, my voice cracking. "You kidnapped me." That earned me a faint smirk, though he didn't turn around. "Would you rather I'd left you bleeding in the rain?" I wanted to hate him for his arrogance, for his composure, for how my pulse raced just from the sound of his voice. But the truth was cruel. Part of me was grateful, even if I didn't understand why. He finally turned, meeting my eyes again, and for the first time I noticed something behind his expression. Not softness, but sorrow, ancient and buried deep. "You're safe here," he said, "for now." I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" He studied me for a long, unbearable moment before speaking. "Lorenzo Moretti," he said, "and whether you live or die now depends on what I decide." The room seemed to shrink around me. I didn't know his name then, not really. I didn't know that the man standing before me wasn't a savior, but a storm. That he would become the beginning and the end of everything I thought I was. All I knew was that the night I should have died, the devil decided to keep me. And as his cold eyes lingered on me, I realized I might have been safer bleeding out in that alley. When I woke the second time, the light that seeped through the enormous windows was soft and golden. Yet it felt like an intrusion. A cruel reminder that morning had arrived somewhere beyond the walls that held me captive, though time itself seemed to have lost meaning here. The bed beneath me was enormous, the sheets smooth and faintly perfumed with something I couldn't name. A scent that was rich, expensive, and strangely comforting, like smoke from a fireplace and the ghost of someone's cologne lingering on the air long after they've left. My body felt heavy, as if gravity had deepened inside this place, and though my wounds were bound neatly, my spirit felt frayed, stretched thin by confusion, and an unease that wouldn't loosen its grip. I sat up, clutching the sheet to my chest. my mind replaying the last fragments of memory from the night before. The rain, the alley, the man with the gun, and the shadow who had saved me only to claim me. Lorenzo Moretti. The name tasted like sin and silk on my tongue, the kind of name that could open doors or end lives depending on how it was spoken. I'd heard it whispered before in places where men drank too much and told stories they shouldn't. The Moretti Syndicate, old money soaked in. New blood, a dynasty built not on legacy but on fear. And now somehow, I was in their mansion. The room was absurdly beautiful, too elegant for anything good to happen inside it. The high ceilings were carved with intricate designs that caught the light like gilded veins. The furniture was dark wood, polished to a mirror shine. A vase of white roses sat on the nightstand, their scent delicate yet overpowering, as though they were meant to disguise something rotten beneath. My clothes, the ones I'd worn the night of the shooting, were gone, replaced by a folded dress on the chair beside the bed. Simple but elegant, in a deep shade of wine red that looked too deliberate to be random. I touched the fabric and felt the weight of control in it. Even my appearance here was curated by someone else. The door creaked open before I could gather the courage to move. A woman entered, perhaps in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a posture that betrayed years of discipline. Her black uniform suggested she belonged here, not as a guest, but as part of the machinery that kept this world spinning. "Good morning, miss," she said in an accent that sounded faintly Italian, her tone polite but detached, as though she'd been instructed not to show warmth. "Mr. Moretti requests your presence for breakfast. He said to inform you that your cooperation would be appreciated." Her pause before that last word told me everything. This wasn't a request. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Where am I? How long have I been here? What does he want with me? But the way she stood, the way her eyes never lingered long enough to invite conversation, told me she wasn't the type to answer. So I nodded, my throat tight, and she gave a single approving dip of her chin before leaving me to dress. The dress fit too perfectly, as if someone had measured me while I was unconscious. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Pale, fragile, but draped in the kind of beauty that didn't feel earned. I looked like someone's possession. The hall outside was vast and silent, the kind of silence that hums beneath the surface, alive with tension. The walls were lined with paintings, portraits of men and women with cruelly beautiful faces, each pair of eyes following me as I passed, their stares heavy with unspoken judgment. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath my bare feet, and chandeliers hung like cages of light above me. The woman led me down a corridor that opened into a sunlit dining room overlooking a garden too perfect to be real. And there he was, sitting at the head of a long table, dark suit perfectly tailored, posture effortless yet commanding. Lorenzo Moretti. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment I could have sworn the air itself thickened between us. His eyes were darker in the daylight, more dangerous, and yet something in them, something unguarded, flickered when he saw me. "You clean up nicely," he said, his voice smooth, measured, but carrying a hint of amusement that only made me bristle more. I stood frozen, unsure of where to sit or whether I even should. I didn't have a choice. He smiled faintly, gesturing toward the seat opposite him. Most of us don't. The food laid out on the table looked like a feast. Fruit, pastries, coffee that smelled like sin itself. Yet the sight of it made my stomach twist. I sat slowly, watching him, trying to make sense of the man who had saved my life only to imprison me in his gilded cage. "Why am I here?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He took a sip of coffee, eyes still on me. "Because you would have died if I hadn't brought you here." "That doesn't explain why you didn't let me go afterward?" "No," he said, setting his cup down with deliberate precision. It doesn't. Silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable. Then, almost casually, he added, "You saw something that night. Something you shouldn't have that makes you a liability." I stiffened. So this is what? Witness protection? Mafia edition? That earned me a low chuckle, dark and humorless. "You have spirit," he said, leaning back in his chair, the corner of his mouth curving just slightly. "But spirit doesn't change the rules of survival." "Then what do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my effort to keep it steady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me with unnerving calm, as though dissecting every thought behind my eyes. "Right now, I want you alive," he said finally. "After that, we'll see." It wasn't an answer. It was a warning dressed as mercy. I wanted to hate him, to scream at him, to call him the monster he so clearly was, but when his gaze met mine, I felt something shift. A strange, magnetic pull that made my pulse stutter, a recognition I couldn't explain. There was something broken in his eyes, something that mirrored my own. He rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, and came around the table. My instinct screamed to move, to create distance, but I couldn't. When he reached me, he placed one hand on the back of my chair, leaning down so close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my neck. "You're safe here, Dolcezza," he murmured, the endearment curling around me like smoke. "But remember, safety has a price." "What price?" I whispered. He straightened, his expression unreadable, but his voice dropped low, like a promise and a threat all at once. "Loyalty." And then he walked away, leaving me sitting there in the silence that followed him. The sound of his footsteps echoing through the hall, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something I couldn't yet see. As I stared at the untouched food before me, I realized I'd crossed some invisible line, that I was no longer a guest or even a prisoner, but something in between, something undefined and dangerous. And though I told myself I hated him, that I would find a way out, a small, traitorous part of me wondered what it would cost to make a man like Lorenzo Moretti see me as something worth keeping. The woman returned to escort me back to my room, her eyes never meeting mine, and as we walked through the endless corridors, I caught sight of something. A closed door at the end of the hall, guarded by two men in black. For a fleeting second, it opened just enough for me to glimpse what was inside. Photographs, maps, and a wall covered in names. My name was one of them. And next to it, in bold red ink, was a single word. Asset. Time in the mansion didn't move like it did in the real world. It stretched and coiled around me like smoke, days blurring together in the same dim light and the same oppressive silence that pressed against my chest, until even my own thoughts began to feel like trespassers. I didn't know how long I'd been here. Hours, maybe days. Because there were no clocks in my room, no phones, no way to track the rhythm of normal life. I existed in a kind of suspended reality, the kind that made you question whether freedom was something you'd actually lost, or just something you'd dreamed of once and forgotten. Lorenzo hadn't come to see me since that morning in the dining room, but his presence lingered in every inch of the house, in the quiet authority of the guards stationed at every doorway, in the cautious glances of the staff who moved like ghosts through the corridors, and in the knowledge that somewhere behind one of those locked doors, he was watching, waiting, deciding what to do with me. I told myself I didn't care, that I hated him, that I wanted nothing more than to find a way out and never see his face again. But the truth was far uglier. I thought about him constantly, the way his voice had curled around the word loyalty, the way his gaze had pinned me in place as if I were already his to command. The only thing that kept me from unraveling completely was curiosity, that dangerous instinct that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. I needed to understand what kind of man Lorenzo Moretti really was, and what he wanted with me. So when the door to my room finally opened one evening, and the same woman, Lucia, appeared with her impeccable uniform and her carefully measured tone saying, "Mr. Moretti would like to see you." I felt something dark and electric stir inside me. Fear, yes, but also something that felt dangerously close to anticipation. She led me through a maze of hallways I hadn't seen before, the walls lined with old paintings whose eyes seemed to follow us, until we reached a set of tall double doors carved with vines and roses that looked almost alive in the candlelight. Lucia knocked once, then opened them and gestured for me to step inside. The room was vast, warm with amber light, and dominated by a grand piano near the window, its black surface gleaming like obsidian. Lorenzo stood by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his jacket discarded over a chair, the top buttons of his shirt undone. He looked less like a man and more like a story, one written in shadows and secrets and the kind of quiet power that makes everyone else small. When he looked up, his gaze found me instantly, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. "Sit," he said, his voice smooth, unhurried, commanding in a way that made refusal feel impossible. I hesitated, but only for a breath, before crossing the room and sitting in the chair opposite him. The fire crackled softly between us, its light throwing golden reflections into his eyes. "You've been quiet," he said, studying me. "You've been gone," I replied, though I regretted the sharpness in my voice the moment it left my lips. He tilted his head slightly, almost amused. "Did you miss me?" I forced a laugh, but it sounded brittle even to my own ears. "You kidnapped me. That's not exactly the kind of thing that inspires longing." He smiled faintly, the expression more dangerous than any glare could have been. "You're alive because I decided you should be. Don't mistake mercy for obligation." Something inside me twisted. Anger, humiliation, and the unbearable awareness of how calm he remained while I burned. "Then what am I?" I demanded. "A prisoner? A pet? Some kind of project?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward me, slow and deliberate, each step calculated, the sound of his shoes on the marble floor echoing like a heartbeat. When he finally stopped in front of me, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the armrests of my chair, trapping me in place. His scent, cedar, smoke, danger, filled the air between us, and I had to force myself not to look away. "You're a problem," he said quietly, "and I don't like problems." "Then why not get rid of me?" I asked, and though my voice trembled, I met his gaze. He studied me for a long time before speaking. "Because you intrigue me," he said, and something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "You shouldn't. You're reckless, impulsive, a journalist who doesn't know when to stop digging. But when I look at you—" He trailed off, his jaw clenching as though he'd revealed too much. "You remind me of something I thought I'd buried." The air between us thickened, heavy with something unspoken. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, a wild rhythm that matched the flicker of firelight on his skin. "Tell me what you want," I said softly, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. His eyes darkened. "I want your loyalty." "Loyalty," I echoed, the word tasting foreign. "To what? To you?" "To survival," he said simply. "Mine and yours." He stepped back then, his control returning like a shutter closing over something raw. "I'm offering you a bargain," he said. "You can stay here under my protection. You'll be safe, cared for, untouched by anyone who would harm you. In return, you'll do what I ask. When I say attend an event, you'll go. When I say stay silent, you'll hold your tongue. You'll be useful to me, and in exchange, you'll live." My mouth went dry. "And if I refuse?" His expression didn't change, but his voice did. It softened, the kind of softness that comes before a storm. "Then I'll let the world outside finish what it started the night I found you." It wasn't a threat. It was a truth spoken with the ease of someone who'd long accepted the cost of power. I wanted to say no, to tell him that I'd rather die than become his pawn. But the image of that alley came rushing back. The gun, the blood, the cold. And I realized I didn't have the courage for martyrdom. I was already in his world, already marked. And there was no way out that didn't lead to a grave. So I looked at him, really looked at him, at the man whose mercy was more dangerous than most men's wrath. And I said the only thing I could. "What exactly do you want me to do?" He smiled then, slow and deliberate, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "I need someone I can trust at my side," he said. "Someone the public can see, someone who makes me look untouchable. In a few days I'll be attending a gathering. Allies, rivals, enemies who pretend to be friends. I want you to come with me. You'll be my fiancé." The words hit like a physical blow. "You're what?" "My fiancé," he repeated, almost lazily, as if the word carried no weight at all. "It's a facade, of course, but one that serves its purpose. No one suspects a woman who looks like she belongs." I stood abruptly, my pulse racing. "You want me to pretend to be in love with you?" He regarded me coolly. "I want you to act like you could be. The rest will come naturally." The arrogance of it should have made me furious, but instead it left me unsteady, the room spinning just slightly as his words settled into me. I wanted to believe I could resist him, that I could play his game long enough to find a way out. But the way he was looking at me made it clear that this wasn't a game. "You'll have everything you need," he continued, turning back to the fireplace. "Clothes, jewelry, a new name if necessary. You'll stay by my side, smile when I say, speak only when spoken to. Do that, and you'll have my protection. Fail me, and you'll understand what it means to lose it." He poured another glass of whiskey and held it out to me. "Do we have an agreement?" My hand shook as I reached for it, the glass cold against my skin. "You're asking for a lot." "I'm giving you more," he said quietly. I hesitated, then nodded, the words barely escaping my lips. "Fine, I'll do it." "Good," he said, and something like satisfaction flickered in his eyes. "Then welcome to the family, cara mia." As he turned away, the firelight catching the hard line of his jaw, I realized I had just made a deal with the devil, one that didn't demand my soul, at least not yet, but something far more dangerous. Because deep down, in some buried, treacherous corner of my heart, I already knew that pretending to love Lorenzo Moretti might be the easiest part of all. It began the next morning, not with a conversation or a warning, but with the quiet, deliberate intrusion of women I'd never met carrying boxes wrapped in silk ribbons, their faces expressionless, and their movements choreographed with the precision of people who served a man whose power could not be questioned. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my coffee, the only familiar thing in a world that no longer made sense, and watched as they moved through the room like a storm disguised as grace, unpacking dresses of every shade, jewelry that glimmered like captured lightning, and shoes so beautiful they looked like they were meant for someone else's life. Lucia stood near the window, supervising with her usual calm detachment, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Mr. Moretti asked that you be fitted for the gala," she said, her tone neutral, polite, as if we were discussing the weather, and not the fact that I was being sculpted into a lie. "He's requested that you wear something memorable." Memorable. The word felt like both a command and a curse, because it wasn't enough to exist in Lorenzo's world. You had to be seen, admired, desired, envied. You had to play your part so flawlessly that no one dared to look close enough to see the cracks. As the seamstresses circled me, measuring, pinning, whispering in Italian, I caught my reflection in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her shoulders pulled back, her chin lifted, her expression uncertain but quietly defiant. She didn't look like the terrified journalist who had stumbled into an alley and nearly died. She looked like someone who belonged in this mansion. Someone who might even be able to handle a man like Lorenzo Moretti. But the illusion faltered when I looked into my own eyes. Because beneath the surface shimmer of confidence, there was something else. A flicker of fear, yes, but also something darker. Something that made my pulse quicken at the thought of seeing him again. When the women finally left, leaving behind an ocean of fabric and perfume and silence, I found myself pacing the room, my hands trembling, though I couldn't tell if it was anger or anticipation. I kept thinking about his words. "You'll act like you could love me. The rest will come naturally." It haunted me, that quiet arrogance, the certainty with which he said it. The terrifying part was that he wasn't wrong. The door opened just as I was trying to steady my breathing, and Lorenzo stepped inside without knocking, dressed in a black suit that looked as though it had been cut specifically to make the rest of the world feel inferior. His presence filled the space effortlessly, as if the room itself had been waiting for him to arrive before it could remember how to breathe. His eyes moved over me slowly, assessing, unhurried, the way a sculptor might study a piece of marble before deciding where to strike. "You clean up well," he said finally. And though his tone was measured, there was a trace of something else there. Approval, maybe, or possession. "I didn't have much choice," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "There's always a choice," he replied, moving closer until I could feel the heat of him, his presence so commanding that I had to fight the urge to step back. "But not all of them end well." He reached out, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from my shoulder, his fingers grazing the side of my neck with the lightest touch, and the air between us seemed to contract. "This color suits you," he murmured, his eyes lingering for a fraction too long. I swallowed hard, hating the way my body responded, how even the simplest contact from him sent a spark racing through my skin. "You said this was an act," I managed to say, though my voice came out softer than I intended. "It is," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "But the best lies are the ones that feel real." He turned then, breaking the moment, his composure sliding back into place as easily as a mask. "The car will be ready at 7. You'll stay by my side the entire evening. Speak only when I tell you to, and smile when people look your way. I'll handle the rest." He left before I could respond, and I stood there for a long time after the door closed, trying to gather the scattered fragments of myself that always seemed to splinter whenever he was near. When evening came, the house transformed into a flurry of movement. Guards stationed by the entrance, black cars idling in the courtyard, the low murmur of men's voices drifting through the hallways. Lucia helped me into the gown Lorenzo had chosen. A deep crimson silk that shimmered like wine in candlelight, fitted perfectly to my body, the kind of dress that made it impossible to forget you were being looked at. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the diamond clasp at my throat, but when I looked in the mirror this time, something inside me hardened. If this was the part I had to play to survive, then I would play it to perfection. The moment I stepped into the grand hall, Lorenzo turned toward me, and the faint flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly masked by composure, was all the validation I needed. He offered his arm, and though I hesitated for a breath, I took it, my fingers brushing against the fabric of his sleeve, the warmth of his body seeping through. As we descended the marble staircase together, he leaned slightly closer, his voice a low murmur meant for me alone. "Remember, Dolcezza, tonight you belong to me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a vow and a warning, and the strangest part was how easily they slipped under my skin. The drive to the event was silent, except for the faint hum of the engine and the soft sound of rain beginning to fall again, as if the night itself was conspiring to remind me where this story had begun. I stole glances at him from the corner of my eye, the way his hands rested on his lap, relaxed but ready. The faint stubble on his jaw, the focus in his gaze that spoke of a man who was always calculating, always 2 moves ahead. When we arrived, cameras flashed, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. The building loomed above us, a glass and marble monument to wealth and corruption. And as we stepped out of the car, the air buzzed with attention. He placed a hand at the small of my back, guiding me forward, and the touch was possessive in a way that made my heart lurch. Inside, the room glittered with chandeliers and false laughter, the air thick with perfume and deceit. People turned to look as we entered, men in sharp suits, women in diamonds that caught the light like broken promises. And I felt their eyes on me, assessing, envying, whispering. Lorenzo's hand never left mine. "Smile," he murmured without looking at me, and I did, even though my pulse was racing. He introduced me to people I'd only ever read about, men who controlled entire empires from behind closed doors, women whose beauty was a weapon sharper than any knife. And with every handshake and forced smile, I felt the walls closing in. But beneath the anxiety, there was something else. A strange, dangerous thrill. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. When the music slowed and the crowd began to thin, Lorenzo guided me onto the terrace overlooking the city. The night air was cool, the rain gone, the lights below stretching endlessly like a constellation of secrets. He stood beside me, silent for a long time, before finally saying, "You did well tonight." "Is that your way of saying thank you?" I asked, turning to face him. He looked at me then. Really looked, his expression unreadable. "You're learning." The silence that followed was thick with everything unspoken between us. The bargain, the danger, the strange current that hummed beneath every word. I should have walked away, gone back inside, ended the night before it turned into something I couldn't control. But instead I stayed, drawn to the darkness in his eyes, to the gravity of a man who could destroy me with a thought, and make me crave his approval anyway. When he reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist, I didn't pull away. "You're trembling," he said softly, and there was something almost tender in his voice. "Maybe I'm scared," I whispered. "Good," he murmured. "Fear keeps you alive." He let go, his hand falling away as he turned back toward the ballroom, his voice low but clear. "Tomorrow we talk about loyalty." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me standing on the terrace with the city sprawling beneath me, my heart pounding against my ribs as the truth settled in like a warning. That whatever tomorrow brought, it wouldn't be about survival anymore. It would be about surrender. The days that followed the gala bled into one another like watercolors left out in the rain, each hour both endless and fleeting. The memory of that night lingering in my veins like something intoxicating I couldn't wash away. I told myself it was only adrenaline, the pressure of pretending, of playing the role of the devoted fiancé beside a man whose name could silence a room. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way he had looked at me on that terrace, the faint flicker of something raw behind the mask he wore so flawlessly, and I knew that what bound me to him wasn't fear alone. I began to move through the mansion differently, no longer as a captive counting the cracks in the walls, but as someone who had begun, reluctantly, to learn its rhythm. I memorized the sound of footsteps in the hall, the patterns of guards changing shifts, the subtle way the staff avoided certain doors as though the very air beyond them was forbidden. I still wanted to escape, or at least that's what I told myself. But a part of me was beginning to crave understanding more than freedom. Because the more time I spent within these walls, the more I realized that Lorenzo Moretti wasn't simply a man of violence and power. He was a man of contradictions, the kind of contradiction that draws you in even as it destroys you. The first time I found him again after the gala, he was in his study, the door slightly ajar, his voice low and calm as he spoke to someone on the phone in rapid Italian. I didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Controlled, lethal, the kind of calm that could precede either a deal or a death. When he hung up, he didn't look surprised to see me standing there. In fact, I almost thought he'd known I was listening. "You shouldn't sneak around my house," he said without looking up, his attention still fixed on a glass decanter he was refilling. "I wasn't sneaking," I lied, stepping inside before I could lose my nerve. "I just wanted to talk." "About what?" he asked, finally turning to face me. "About what happens next," I said, hating the way my voice softened under his gaze. He studied me for a long moment, then gestured for me to sit. "What happens next depends on whether I can trust you." I sank into the chair across from his desk, my pulse fluttering like trapped wings. "And how do I convince you of that?" It began with silence, not the comfortable kind that exists between two people who understand each other, but the kind that feels alive, watchful, heavy, with everything unspoken and everything denied. The days after the gala passed in slow, dreamlike fragments, a blur of glittering faces, whispered deals, and sleepless nights haunted by the echo of his voice, by the phantom warmth of his hand at the small of my back, by the terrifying realization that I was starting to crave the very man whose world had almost destroyed me. I told myself it was fear, that the strange ache in my chest whenever he wasn't near was just the echo of adrenaline, the ghost of survival. But deep down, I knew I was lying, and that knowledge felt more dangerous than any gun ever could. Lorenzo had changed too. I could sense it in the way he moved, slower, heavier, as if burdened by something unseen, and in the rare moments when his composure cracked, when his jaw would tighten at some invisible memory, when his gaze would drift to the window with that faraway darkness that looked almost like longing. He tried to hide it behind his command of routine, behind the endless calls and the quiet fury that simmered whenever business went wrong. But I saw it. The hollow space behind his control. The ghost of a woman who still lived somewhere in the wreckage of his past. I found her one night, though not in the way I expected. It was late, long past midnight, when the storm began. Thunder rolling over the sea like the sound of distant war. Lightning slicing through the sky, illuminating the halls of the mansion in stark, blinding flashes. I couldn't sleep. The noise outside too violent, too alive. So I wandered the corridors barefoot, the silk hem of my robe whispering against the marble floor. The house felt different at night, less like a prison and more like a labyrinth of memories, filled with doors that hid more than they revealed. I don't know what drew me to his wing of the house. Curiosity, loneliness, or the quiet pull of a gravity I no longer wanted to resist. But before I realized it, I was standing outside his office, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I shouldn't have gone in. I knew that. But storms have a way of making people reckless, and I was already too far gone to pretend that the rules still applied to me. The room was dark, lit only by the flicker of the fireplace and the faint glow of a lamp on his desk. Papers were scattered across it, along with a half-empty glass of whiskey and an ashtray that held the remains of cigarettes burned down to nothing. And on the wall, photographs. Dozens of them, framed and arranged in a way that told a story even before I could piece it together. At first, I thought they were old business associates or family members, but as I moved closer, my breath caught. They were all of her. The woman who came before me. She was beautiful, not in the polished, perfect way of the women I'd seen at the gala, but in a way that felt real, alive, with a kind of warmth that even the photographs couldn't contain. Her hair was dark and wild, her smile soft, but fearless, her eyes full of light. And though I didn't want to see it, though I told myself it couldn't be true, there was no denying it. She looked like me. Not identical, but close enough that the resemblance felt cruel, like a mirror built for ghosts. I didn't hear him enter until his voice sliced through the silence behind me. "What are you doing in here?" I turned sharply, my heart slamming against my ribs. He stood in the doorway, half in shadow, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned. "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. "I was walking and you decided to go through my things?" He interrupted, his tone low, dangerous, but not quite angry. "Not yet." "I saw the door open," I lied, though the lie tasted like ash. "I didn't mean to." He took a step closer, and the firelight caught his face, illuminating the hard lines carved by years of control and grief. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," I whispered, my gaze flickering toward the wall. "Who is she?" His silence was an answer of its own, long and heavy, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Finally, he said, "She was someone I couldn't protect." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of loss so deep it made my chest ache. "She looks like me," I said, the confession trembling out before I could stop it. He smiled bitterly, no warmth in it. "Yes," he said, his voice rough. "That's the problem." Something inside me twisted painfully, a mix of anger and pity, and something I didn't want to name. "Is that why you saved me? Because I look like her?" He didn't answer, and the silence between us filled with the sound of the storm outside, the rain beating against the windows like desperate hands. I should have walked away then, but instead I moved closer, unable to bear the distance between us. "Tell me about her," I said softly. He stared at the fire for a long time before speaking. "Her name was Sophia," he said finally. "She was reckless, brave, too good for this world." He laughed quietly, but it was a hollow sound. "I thought I could keep her safe, but I was wrong. My brother wanted power, and I was too blind to see what he'd do to get it. When she died, I buried what was left of me with her." His voice cracked at the edges, and something inside me shattered with it. Without thinking, I reached out and touched his arm, the contact barely there, but it was enough. He turned to me, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them, and for a moment the mask slipped completely. The man who looked back at me wasn't the Mafia king I'd come to fear, but something rawer, wounded, lost, human. Then the moment broke. He caught my wrist, his grip firm but trembling, his breath unsteady as he whispered, "Don't pity me." "I don't," I said, though even I could hear the lie in my voice. He released me suddenly, stepping back as if the nearness had burned him. "You shouldn't have seen this," he said, his voice cold again. "You don't belong in that part of my life." "Then stop pulling me into it," I snapped before I could stop myself, the words slipping out like a spark to dry tinder. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, he closed the distance between us, his hand rising to cup the back of my neck, his breath hot against my skin. "You think you understand what this is?" he whispered. "You think you know what you're playing with?" My voice trembled, but I didn't pull away. "Then tell me." He stared at me like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and for one breathless heartbeat, I thought he'd kiss me. But instead, he dropped his hand and turned away, his voice rough with restraint. "Go," he said, "before I make a mistake I can't undo." I wanted to move, to obey, but I couldn't. I was rooted there, trapped in the gravity of him. When I finally left, the storm had quieted, but inside me everything still burned. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pain in his face, the ghost of the woman who came before me, and the truth I could no longer ignore. That whatever bound us wasn't about survival anymore. It was obsession, dangerous and consuming. the kind that didn't fade with time but deepened with every touch, every glance, every secret shared in the dark. And I knew, with a kind of sick clarity, that I was no longer just pretending to be his fiancée. I was becoming something far worse, something that belonged to him. The days that followed felt like the slow descent into a fever dream, where reality bled into something darker, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. And though the mansion looked the same, all polished marble, cold light, and quiet order, I could feel it shifting beneath the surface, like the air before a storm that knows exactly when to break. Lorenzo moved through the house like a ghost of himself, silent, brooding, his eyes always elsewhere, his voice low and clipped when he spoke to his men, and though no one said it aloud, I could feel the tension humming through every hallway, the unspoken truth that something was about to go terribly, irrevocably wrong. I told myself I shouldn't care, that whatever war brewed in his world had nothing to do with me, that I was only the pretty facade he paraded in front of his enemies, but every time I saw the exhaustion in his face or the haunted way he stared into his glass at night, I felt the fragile walls I'd built between us start to crumble a little more. It terrified me, the way I had begun to understand him, the way cruelty and tenderness coexisted in him like twin flames, how he could hold the world by its throat, and yet look at me as though I was the only thing still capable of making him human. It was near midnight when the illusion of control finally shattered. I was in my room, sitting by the window, the city lights flickering faintly through the rain, when I heard the shouting, sharp, angry voices echoing down the hall, followed by the heavy sound of footsteps and the crash of glass breaking somewhere below. I froze, every nerve in my body on fire, and before I could think, I was already out of my chair and moving, the thin silk of my robe clinging to my skin as I ran down the staircase, barefoot and breathless. The scene in the main hall was chaos. 2 of Lorenzo's men had another pinned against the wall, blood trickling from his lip, while Lorenzo himself stood in the center, calm but deadly, his gun hanging loosely at his side. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to hum through the air, and though no one spoke, I could feel the crackling edge of violence that hung between them. When Lorenzo finally did speak, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something final. "You sold me out." The man pressed against the wall shook his head, desperate. "I swear, boss, I didn't—" Lorenzo didn't let him finish. The gunshot was deafening, echoing off the marble walls like thunder, and for a moment, no one moved. The man's body slumped to the floor, lifeless, a dark bloom spreading across his chest, and I could taste the iron tang of blood in the air. The others didn't even flinch. They just nodded grimly and dragged the body away, the sound of it scraping against the floor making my stomach twist. Lorenzo stood there for a long moment, unmoving, staring at the blood as if he could read something in it, before he turned sharply and saw me standing at the edge of the staircase. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not surprise, not anger, but something more complicated, something that almost looked like regret. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. I swallowed hard, my pulse still pounding in my throat. I heard shouting. He holstered the gun and took a slow step toward me, his movements controlled, measured, as if he was afraid to move too fast. "There are things you can't unsee, Dolcezza," he murmured. "You'd do well to remember that." But I couldn't stop looking at him, at the blood spattered across his shirt, the faint tremor in his hand, the way his eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken things. I knew this was the part where I should have been afraid, where I should have turned and run, but I wasn't. I was drawn to him the way a moth is drawn to flame, knowing it will burn and going anyway. "What happened?" I asked softly, even though I already knew the answer. He sighed, the sound weary, almost human. "Betrayal," he said, "the only constant in my world." By who? He hesitated, then met my eyes. My brother. The word hit me like a physical blow. I remembered the night in his office, the photographs, the story of Sophia. She died because of my brother. And suddenly, everything made a cruel, perfect kind of sense. I thought he was gone, I said quietly. So did I, Lorenzo replied, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before, something that sounded dangerously close to sorrow. But he's not done with me yet. He walked past me then, heading toward his study, and I followed without thinking, the distance between us collapsing as easily as air. The room was dimly lit, the fire low, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. He poured himself another drink, his hand steady now, though I could see the tension in his shoulders, the storm barely contained beneath the surface. He wants to hurt me, he said, almost to himself. He always did. But he's smart. He knows the only way to destroy me is to take away what I care about. I froze, the words heavy and terrifying, because I knew, or thought I knew, what he meant. You mean your men? He looked up then, his gaze locking onto mine, and the silence that followed said everything. No, he didn't mean them. He meant me. The realization hit like a pulse of cold light, sharp and electric, flooding through me until I couldn't tell if the trembling in my hands was fear or something far more dangerous. Lorenzo, I began, but he cut me off with a look that silenced me. I should send you away, he said, his voice low, strained. That would be the smart thing. But I can't. He took a step closer, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath, feel the heat of him even from a distance. You make me weak, he whispered almost to himself. And I can't decide if that means I should protect you or destroy you before someone else tries. His words should have terrified me, and maybe they did. But there was something else beneath them, something that made my pulse quicken despite the danger, a confession buried in the language of power. You won't hurt me, I said, the words trembling but sure. He smiled then, a slow, bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. No, he murmured, but someone will try, and when they do, I'll burn the world for you. Before I could respond, the door burst open. One of his men, breathing hard, his face pale. Boss, he said. We found a car outside the gate, no plates. They were watching the house. Lorenzo's expression shifted instantly. Calm turned to calculation. Grief replaced by violence. He grabbed his gun from the desk, his body all precision and control again, the softness from moments ago gone as though it had never existed. Stay here, he said, already halfway to the door. No, I said, stepping forward before I could stop myself. You can't go alone. He paused, looking back at me, and for a moment something flickered in his gaze. Something that looked like pride, or maybe warning. I'm never alone, he said. And then he was gone, the door slamming behind him, the echo of his footsteps fading into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space where he'd been, the firelight dancing across the walls, the sound of rain returning like a heartbeat. I told myself not to follow, that I had no place in his war, that I was safer pretending none of this was mine. But safety was a lie I'd stopped believing the night he found me in the alley. So I grabbed my coat and went after him, because I knew, deep down, beneath the fear and the anger and the impossible pull between us, that this wasn't just his war anymore. It was ours. The night I followed Lorenzo into the storm was the night everything changed, though at the time I didn't yet understand what it meant to step past that invisible line between survival and surrender, between fear and something that looked too much like love. The rain came down in sheets so heavy it blurred the world into a wash of shadows and silver light. the kind of rain that makes everything feel cleaner and dirtier all at once. And I remember the taste of it on my lips, cold and sharp, as I ran through the courtyard barefoot, the sound of thunder crashing somewhere in the distance like the echo of a warning I didn't care to hear. The gates loomed ahead, half open, the headlights of Lorenzo's car cutting through the darkness, and before I could think about what I was doing, I was already pulling open the passenger door and sliding inside. He didn't look at me right away, didn't speak, didn't even seem surprised, only exhaled once, slow and resigned, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as though he'd known all along that I would come. "You never listen," he said finally, his voice low, the words half lost beneath the sound of the engine. "You didn't give me a reason to," I replied. And though I tried to sound defiant, my voice betrayed me with its tremor. He glanced at me then, just for a moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. But I saw it. The flicker of something behind his eyes, not anger, but something closer to fear. "This isn't your world," he said quietly, as if trying to convince himself more than me. "And you don't want to see what happens when mine collides with yours." "Too late," I whispered, and it was true. I'd already seen too much, felt too much, become too entangled in the threads of his darkness to ever untangle myself again. The drive was fast and wordless, the city blurring past in streaks of rain and neon. And though the silence between us felt dangerous, it wasn't empty. It pulsed with everything we weren't saying, everything that waited beneath the surface like a storm gathering strength. I could feel him even when he didn't look at me, could sense the tension in his jaw, the way his breathing grew uneven whenever I shifted in my seat, as if the space between us was a living thing with its own pulse. When we finally stopped, it was outside an old warehouse by the docks. The same docks, I realized with a chill, where this had all begun, where I had nearly died the night he saved me. The irony wasn't lost on me, that fate had brought me back to the place where everything had broken, as though the universe itself demanded closure. Lorenzo stepped out first, his gun already in hand, his movements precise and controlled, and I followed him, the cold air biting at my skin, the sound of the sea crashing against the rocks, filling the silence between us. He didn't tell me to stay behind this time, didn't even glance back. Maybe because he knew it wouldn't matter, that I would follow him into the fire if I had to. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of oil and damp metal, and the only light came from a flickering bulb that swung gently overhead. 2 of his men were already there, tense and alert, their faces pale beneath the dim light. "We found the car empty," one of them said. "But there was something left behind." He handed Lorenzo a phone, a cheap burner model, old and scratched. And as Lorenzo took it, the screen lit up with a single message. I saw his expression shift as he read it, saw the muscles in his jaw tighten, the faint tremor in his hand before he crushed the phone in his fist. "What did it say?" I asked, though I already knew it wasn't good. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he said softly, "It said, 'I took something that belongs to you.'" A chill ran through me so deep I almost couldn't breathe. "Your brother," I whispered. He nodded once, his eyes distant, dark. "He wants me to come to him. Alone." I felt my throat tighten. "You can't go." "I don't have a choice," he said, his voice calm but hollow, as if he'd already accepted what was waiting for him. "Yes, you do," I said, stepping closer, my voice trembling now, my heart pounding against my ribs. "You don't have to keep letting him control you. You don't have to walk into another trap just to prove something that isn't even yours to carry anymore." He turned toward me, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Desperation. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't about control. It's about blood." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's about guilt." The words seemed to hit him like a slap, and for a moment all the walls he'd built around himself, all the calm, all the control, cracked. He stepped closer until there was barely a breath of space between us, his voice low, dangerous. "You think you know me?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "I know you hate yourself more than you hate him." For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The rain outside had quieted, the sea gone eerily calm, and the only sound was the ragged rhythm of our breathing. He reached out then, his hand catching my wrist, pulling me against him so suddenly that the air rushed from my lungs. "You shouldn't say things you don't understand," he said, but his voice had lost its edge, and when I looked up, I saw it. The storm behind his eyes, the hunger, the grief, the unbearable tenderness he didn't know how to name. "I understand enough," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You saved me because she died. You kept me because I reminded you of her. But somewhere along the way, that changed, didn't it?" He didn't answer. Instead, he kissed me. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't kind. It was fierce and desperate, and filled with every emotion he'd tried to bury. I felt the heat of him, the violence of his need, the way his hands trembled against my skin as though he hated himself for wanting this, for wanting me. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped him. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because in that moment, everything else fell away. The lies, the danger, the fear. And all that was left was the truth we'd both been denying. That I wanted him just as much as he wanted me. That whatever this was between us, it had already consumed us both. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together, the air thick with something raw and fragile. "This is a mistake," he murmured, his voice rough. "Then let's make it," I said, and before he could answer, I kissed him again. The rest of the night unfolded like a dream I wasn't sure I wanted to wake from. The sound of rain against the roof, the warmth of his body against mine, the way his voice broke when he whispered my name as if it meant salvation and damnation all at once. For the first time, I saw him without his armor, without the mask of the Mafia king who commanded fear. I saw the man beneath it, wounded and human, clinging to me as if I were the last good thing left in his world. But dawn came too soon, bleeding pale light through the cracks in the walls, and when I woke, he was already gone. The space beside me was cold, his scent fading from the sheets, and on the nightstand lay a single note in his handwriting. "Don't follow me." I stared at the words for a long time, my heart twisting painfully, because I knew exactly where he was going. To his brother, to end what had begun years ago, to trade his blood for mine. And though every part of me screamed to stay, to let him fight his own war, I knew I couldn't. Because what I felt for Lorenzo Moretti was no longer just fear, no longer just fascination. It was love, dangerous and consuming, the kind that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't care about consequences. And if the price of that love was my heart, then so be it. The moment I found the note, something inside me shattered. Not with the clean break of anger, but with the slow, splintering sound of heartbreak, the kind that echoes quietly and endlessly in the hollow space it leaves behind. The "words don't follow me" burned in my mind like an accusation, cruel in their simplicity, because he must have known that I would never obey, that there was no world in which I could sit still, while the man who had both saved and ruined me walked willingly into his own destruction. The morning light was cold and colorless, seeping through the thin curtains like smoke, and every breath I took felt heavy with the weight of inevitability. I moved before I had time to think, dressing quickly, my hands trembling as I pulled on the first clothes I could find. Black, the color of defiance, of mourning, of love that had nowhere left to go. The house was too quiet, too still, as though it already knew what had been set in motion, and as I passed through the halls, I could feel the eyes of the staff following me, their silence a warning they didn't dare speak aloud. Lucia appeared at the end of the corridor, her expression unreadable, but when I tried to walk past her, she stepped in my way. "You can't," she said softly, and there was something almost maternal in her tone, something that made me pause for a heartbeat. "I have to," I whispered. "He's going to die." Her gaze flickered, and I thought I saw something like pity there. "He's been dying since the day you met him," she said. "But if you go, you'll die too." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Because some part of me already knew that love like ours didn't end in survival. It ended in blood. It ended in ruin. But it was too late to turn back. I found one of his cars in the garage. One of the black ones with tinted windows, sleek and silent, the kind built for both business and escape. The engine roared to life with a low growl, and as I pulled onto the road, the city stretched out before me like a wound that wouldn't heal. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled like it, that metallic tang of storms and endings. And every mile I drove felt like stepping deeper into the kind of fate you can't outrun. The address I found scrawled on the back of another note in his study led me to the outskirts of the city, to an abandoned estate that had once belonged to his family, a sprawling shell of a mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was a place that reeked of history and heartbreak, of wealth long decayed and sins long buried, and even before I saw the cars lined up outside, I knew I was too late to stop whatever had already begun. I parked behind a row of trees and crept forward, my breath shallow, my heartbeat loud in my ears. From the broken windows of the house came the sound of shouting. Lorenzo's voice, low and furious, and another that carried a colder kind of authority, the kind that came from blood ties and betrayal. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with tension and the faint smell of gasoline, sharp and unmistakable. The grand hall was a ruin. Marble cracked, dust thick on the floor, a chandelier hanging crooked from the ceiling. But none of that mattered, because in the center of the room stood Lorenzo, and the man who was unmistakably his brother. I knew it the moment I saw him. The resemblance was uncanny, not just in the shape of his face or the darkness of his eyes, but in the way he carried himself. That same quiet menace wrapped in charm. But where Lorenzo's darkness felt controlled, deliberate, his brother's felt wild, unhinged, as though he had long since made peace with his own madness. "You took everything from me," Lorenzo was saying, his voice steady but his hands trembling as he held his gun, not quite raised, not quite lowered. "You killed her. You destroyed our family. And now you think I'll let you take what's left." His brother, Marco, I heard one of the men whisper once, months ago, laughed, low and cold. "You destroyed yourself, brother. You always did. You and that cursed heart of yours, always mistaking weakness for love." His gaze shifted, and when he saw me standing in the doorway, a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. And there it is again. The weakness. Lorenzo turned, and the moment our eyes met, something inside me broke. "I told you not to come," he said, his voice sharp with anger. But beneath it, I could hear the fear. "I wasn't going to let you die alone," I said, my voice trembling but certain. For a moment, everything went still. The air, the light, even the ocean roaring below the cliffs. And then, as if that fragile pause had been holding back the flood, chaos erupted. Marco's men moved first, guns drawn, shouts echoing off the walls, and Lorenzo grabbed my arm, pulling me behind a pillar just as bullets shattered the air. The sound was deafening, a storm of violence and light, and I could taste blood and salt on my tongue as plaster rained down around us. He fired back, his movements quick, precise, efficient. The cold grace of a man who had killed before and would kill again. And though I wanted to look away, I couldn't. Because there was something terrible and beautiful in the way he fought. something that reminded me of the night he'd found me, the night he'd saved me, the night I'd stopped belonging to myself. When the gunfire paused, the silence that followed was worse, the kind that buzzes in your ears, that makes you realize how close you've come to dying. Lorenzo turned to me, his face streaked with dirt and blood, his eyes wild. "Go," he said. "Get out, now." "I'm not leaving you," I said, and before he could stop me, I reached for him, my hands gripping his shoulders. "You don't get to tell me how this ends." He stared at me, his chest heaving, and for a moment I saw the conflict tear through him, the instinct to protect me warring with the knowledge that I was already too deep, that there was no safety left for either of us. "I can't lose you too," he whispered, and the sound of it broke me. "You won't," I said. "Not this time." And then the world exploded again. A flash of light, the roar of fire, the sharp sting of heat as something ignited in the far corner of the hall. The gasoline. I realized it too late. The air filled with smoke, thick and choking, and the flames spread fast, racing up the walls like they'd been waiting for this moment all along. Lorenzo grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the stairs, but before we could move, Marco stepped out of the haze, his gun raised, his smile unshaken even as the fire danced around him. "You always had to be the hero, didn't you, brother?" he sneered. "Even now, when there's nothing left to save." Lorenzo turned, his own weapon rising, and for a split second I saw them. Two men bound by the same blood, the same ghosts, the same sin. And then the gunfire came, a single echoing shot that split the air and drowned everything else. I didn't know who fired first. I didn't even know who fell. All I knew was that the world tilted, the heat roared, and Lorenzo's hand slipped from mine as the smoke swallowed him whole. I screamed his name, my voice lost in the fire, and somewhere deep inside me, I felt something break that could never be repaired. The last thing I remember was the sound of sirens in the distance, the taste of ash in my mouth, and the faint, impossible whisper of his voice through the smoke. "Run." And then everything went dark. When I woke, the world was quiet in that unnatural way that makes you wonder whether silence itself has a pulse. And for a long moment, I didn't know where I was, or whether I was still alive because everything around me was white and too still, too clean. The kind of sterile emptiness that could only belong to hospitals or dreams. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and smoke. And beneath that, something else. Something that clung to my skin, to my hair, to my memories. The ghost of fire. I tried to sit up, but pain surged through my body like electricity, sharp and immediate. And it was then that I saw the bandages wrapping my arms, the bruises blooming across my ribs, the thin IV line feeding life into veins that had already forgotten what it felt like to want it. For a moment, I didn't remember the fire or the gunshot or the sound of Lorenzo's voice vanishing into the smoke. I only remembered the way his hand had slipped from mine, and the sound of my name breaking on his lips like a prayer he never finished. When the memories returned, they came all at once. The heat, the light, the shattering of glass, the smell of burning wood and gasoline, the scream that might have been mine. I remembered falling, or maybe being pulled down, the world spinning into a blur of orange and black, the sound of sirens wailing somewhere far away, the feel of strong arms lifting me through the flames. But when I tried to remember his face, when I tried to remember whether it was Lorenzo who carried me out, all I could see was smoke. Lucia was there when I opened my eyes again, her posture as precise as ever, but her expression softer now, edged with exhaustion and something that looked almost like sorrow. "You're lucky to be alive," she said, her voice low, her words careful, as if each one had to be weighed before it reached me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Where is he?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation I felt the world begin to crack again. "He's gone," she said finally. and though her tone was calm, the tremor beneath it was enough to shatter whatever fragile hope I had left. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, he's not." "The building collapsed," she continued, her eyes lowering. "The fire reached the foundation before the paramedics arrived. They found his brother's body, not his." "Then he's alive," I said, my voice desperate now, clinging to the word like it could hold back the tide. "He's alive, Lucia." But she didn't answer. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't end, the kind that settles into your bones, that builds a home in the hollow parts of you, that waits until the night to whisper its truths. I turned away from her then, the ache in my chest heavier than the pain in my body, and I closed my eyes because I couldn't bear to see the pity in hers. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time lost meaning the same way light loses direction underwater. I recovered in fragments, my body healing faster than my heart, though both felt like strangers now. People came and went, doctors, nurses, men in suits who spoke quietly outside my room, but I barely heard them. The mansion was gone, the empire burned, and I was left with nothing but the echo of a voice that had once promised to keep me safe, and the memory of a man who had loved me the only way he knew how, dangerously. One night, when the moon hung low over the sea and the world felt unbearably still, I found the strength to leave. Lucia helped me sign the papers, her eyes red though she pretended they weren't, and she pressed something into my hand before I left. A small silver lighter engraved with an insignia I recognized instantly. LM. "He wanted you to have it," she said. And then, before I could ask how she knew, she was gone. The city outside was both familiar and foreign, washed clean by rain but still heavy with the scent of the past. I walked until my legs ached, until I found myself standing by the edge of the same sea that had witnessed everything. The docks where he saved me, the horizon where everything had begun. The waves crashed against the rocks, wild and relentless. And I thought about how life is sometimes like that. How it keeps breaking against what it cannot change, how it destroys and rebuilds in the same breath. I held the lighter in my palm, its weight small but infinite, and for the first time since the fire I let myself cry. Not the fragile kind of crying that begs for comfort, but the kind that empties you out, that strips everything away until you're nothing but the truth of your own pain. I don't know how long I stood there before I heard it. The faint crunch of gravel behind me, the sound of footsteps that stopped when I turned. For a heartbeat, I thought I was imagining it, another cruel trick of grief. But then I saw him. Lorenzo. Alive. He stood a few paces away, thinner, scarred, his arm in a sling, his face marked by the kind of pain that doesn't fade. But his eyes were the same, dark and endless, filled with the same dangerous tenderness that had always undone me. For a moment neither of us spoke, and the space between us was thick with all the words we'd never said, all the apologies and confessions that burned too bright to name. "I thought you were dead," I whispered finally, my voice breaking on the last word. "I was," he said quietly, "for a while." I took a step toward him, my heart hammering, my breath catching as the moonlight brushed against his face, and though I wanted to touch him, I hesitated, afraid he might vanish if I did. "Why didn't you come to me?" He smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it, only sadness. "Because I needed you to be free of me, because everything I touch burns." "Then let it burn," I said, and before he could answer, I closed the distance between us and pressed my hands to his chest, feeling the steady, impossible rhythm of his heart beneath my palms. "We've already walked through fire, Lorenzo. What's left to fear?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the war in his eyes, the guilt, the longing, the love that had always been both his salvation and his curse. And then he pulled me against him, his arms wrapping around me like the final act of surrender, his voice rough against my hair. You should have hated me, he said. Maybe I do, I whispered, but I love you more. We stood there as the tide crept closer, the sound of the sea rising around us like the heartbeat of something ancient and merciless. And for the first time, the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with forgiveness, with the fragile, stubborn hope that maybe broken things don't always stay broken. He tilted my chin upward, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, and when he kissed me, it wasn't the desperate, burning kiss of the past, but something slower, deeper, a promise written in the language of scars. The wind carried the scent of salt and smoke, and somewhere in the distance the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, soft and golden, as if the world itself had decided to forgive us. When we finally pulled apart, he looked at me with a kind of quiet wonder, his voice low, almost reverent. You were never supposed to be part of this world, he said. I know, I replied, but you were mine before I ever had a choice. He smiled, a real smile this time, small and tired and beautiful, and took my hand. Together we watched the sun rise over the wreckage of everything we'd been, and I thought about how love, at its core, is never about saving or owning or surviving. It's about surrender, about choosing to stand in the fire and letting it change you, even if it leaves nothing but ash. And as the light touched his face, I realized something I should have known all along, that he hadn't saved me from death that night. He had given me something far more dangerous. He had taught me how to live.